Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cara Cookson, if you don't know me, but I think you do know me, and I know all of you. This is trauma-informed communication with some tools for prosecution-based victim service providers. So by that, I mean VWAs, trial assistants. Is everyone able to hear me, by the way? Can I get a thumbs up? Oh, dear. Hold on just a second. People having trouble with the audio this morning?
I can hear you just fine.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Joanna. Okay. Julie is having trouble with her equipment this morning. Okay. So thanks for coming. If you have any other issues, slow me down, especially I've been having a little bit of connectivity issues this morning. Moving on. So today, in an hour and a half, which is how much time we have for this, we're going to start thinking about practicing more effective approaches for working with victims and, frankly, other people that we might encounter in our day-to-day work who have been impacted by trauma. And it's also an opportunity to think about gaps that we might have in our own learning on trauma so that we can seek more knowledge and skills and information. So, by that, I mean, if you're somebody who works specifically on the domestic violence or sexual assault docket, there is a whole universe of knowledge and skills to develop around working with trauma survivors who have experienced those specific types of victimization. Today is meant to be really broad brushstrokes, really basic information that helps us to know what we don't know. And I'm also going to share a couple little small tips and tricks to help us along the way. So much of this is just about being present in ourselves and using our common sense and emotional intelligence to help us make our way through. So whenever I give trainings on trauma, even with a group of folks like you who spend all day working with people who've experienced trauma, I think it's really important to remind everyone that the experts are already here. Statistically, many of us have experienced pretty significant trauma ourselves in our lives. And because of the vicarious trauma that many of us have encountered in our especially difficult cases, the stuff that we're going to talk about, again, even though we talk about this all day, might be re-traumatizing, might be triggering. And if you feel in your body some signs that you might be experiencing a little bit of that re-traumatization, take a break. I encourage you to take a break. I know for a training like this, you might be thinking, oh, well, I do this all day and that's fine. But this is actually a great opportunity to practice sort of noticing in our bodies when we need to take a break. Okay, my first question to all of you, and you've been around long enough to know, is what does it feel like when we are swimming in the trauma soup? You can put a note in the chat, you can unmute yourself. And by that, I mean, working with folks who have encountered who have experienced trauma all day, what is it like? What does it feel like sometimes? Good or bad? It's exhausting is one comment I've got. What else? Anything?
I feel like it empties your bucket, if that makes sense. I'm all about filling your bucket. I feel like it empties your bucket. So lots of times at the end of the day, you go home feeling depleted and
Yep.
like you have like nothing left to give, like I hope nobody asks me for anything at home, which never happens, but you just feel depleted. It empties your bucket.
Yeah, no, that's true. Joanna says sometimes it's inspiring. It is. I mean, in this work, we get to encounter people all day who have overcome some pretty amazing things. And we can learn a lot from folks. Kim says it can feel really helpless, knowing that no matter what you do for the person, it might never be enough. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too, Kim. And I feel like in our culture, there's this sort of shared narrative or story that's informed by like TV and movies that like there's some magical destination where people arrive and they're healed of their trauma, and that place where it's over for most people, depending on what they've experienced, might not actually exist. I mean, trauma changes us, and it doesn't mean that the way that it changes us is permanent, but it can really cause an impact, and that can't necessarily be recovered from, and that can be exhausting when we feel those expectations to get someone to a place, when they have expectations to kind of land at a place, especially within the context that you all are working in, because while the criminal justice process, especially these days, can be a very long process, it's really a short period of time, relatively speaking, in the course of someone's experience. Julie is saying that she still can't hear anything. And I think everyone can hear me. So I think it's an issue on Julie's end, and it's probably how you're connecting to your audio, Julie. And I don't know how to help you on that one, but this will be recorded so you can come back to it. Okay. Anyone else want to chime in with other comments or thoughts? Okay, we've got lots of suggestions about how to make today work for Julie. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about vocabulary just to make sure we're all on the same page a little bit. So I consider a traumatic experience to be one that causes harm or causes someone to fear for their personal safety. And there are a lot of obvious sources of trauma. For us, we're dealing with folks who've experienced victimization. So they've had harm inflicted on them, and that's a very common source of trauma. Some of the folks we're working with might have experienced a motor vehicle crash as part of their victimization. That's a common source of trauma. Folks also can show up with having experienced complex or childhood trauma. So sort of repeated instances of trauma. And that is, in and of itself, can have huge impacts on the brain and on the body. I also want to point out, we are experiencing in our world right now a huge collective trauma. And we need to make sure that Brian is muted. He is, good. We're experiencing a huge collective trauma, and that is around us, and that is impacting the people that we're working with. I think it's really important that, especially folks who are new to the work, someone might present to you with having experienced a crime that is doesn't seem that serious, doesn't seem like it would be that traumatic. But what we don't want to forget is that that person might be showing up in the way that they're showing up and acting the way that they're acting because of other sources of trauma that they've experienced in our lives. And so we don't want to treat people like the type of victimization that shows up. Now, the type of victimization they've experienced might tell us a lot and it might be really helpful, but we want to see each person as an individual person. And anyone could be presenting with a whole history of things in the background that could be affecting our relationship with them. The other thing I think it's really important to be clear about from a vocabulary perspective, especially these days, we hear the word PTSD. We hear that clinical mental health diagnosis thrown around a lot. Everyone is PTSD. And I think it's really important to keep in mind and remember that PTSD is a clinical mental health diagnosis, just like anxiety or bipolar disorder, depression. And that's based on someone presenting with a series of symptoms that meet the diagnostic criteria. Trauma can cause or exacerbate symptoms that then cause someone to meet that criteria. And so a doctor says you have PTSD, you have anxiety, whatever it is. But trauma and the experience of trauma doesn't always cause PTSD, and someone with trauma doesn't always have PTSD. It's really two different things that are often very interconnected and overlap. Okay, so back in June, the folks with Mikasa did a huge trauma-informed care workshop. That's in our recordings. There's a great video there on how the brain works when it experiences trauma, what some of the common trauma reactions are. I'm not going to go back and sort of redo all of that and how the trauma brain works, but what I am going to do is just remind us of some of those fundamentals. So our brains are wired to protect us. And so when people are experiencing trauma, our brain is defaulting to survival mode and trying to help our bodies do what they need to do in order to protect us. That survival mode response is good. It's good that our brains help us to fight, flight, or freeze. And there are some others that people will add on sometimes. That response comes from a part of our brain called the amygdala. And the trouble with the amygdala is that in engaging in that trauma response, especially if someone is continuing to experience that trauma response beyond the point where, when the incident, the traumatic event is over, it can shut down or confuse the more human parts, the more highly evolved parts of our brains that are responsible for logic and reasoning, executive functioning. So if you're not familiar with that term, that's like you all exercise executive functioning to show up here today. You got an email that told you when to be here. You put it in your calendar. You used your calendar to figure out when it was going to be. And then today you showed up on time and logged onto Zoom. It's like a series of steps, right? That's our executive functioning. And when you're able to follow those steps, you have good executive functioning skills, right? Creativity and memory. So these are all the parts of our brain that allow us to do the things that humans do as opposed to our dog or our cat. And but the amygdala can shut those parts of our brain down. There's also, I think it's really important to keep in mind, there's no one way to be. So how a person is going to respond to stressful stimulus in the environment or to a traumatic experience is going to depend on their genetics, the actual brain structures that they have. There's this idea of epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. So both the nature and the nurture that's passed down to us from our families. There's our social conditioning and the experiences that we have as a child. So if I'm a flight person, I don't know about you, if I see a snake in the yard, I'm going to run. I'm not a fight person. And I think that that's a product in some ways of my social conditioning. It might also be a product of my gender and sort of cultural messages that we pick up over time around how to be. And then obviously our past trauma is also going to dictate how we might respond to a traumatic experience in the future. I also think it's important for us to remember, because again, we want to see the people we're working with as whole people. Not every traumatic experience has a negative impact. That there's ways that the body is able to sort of metabolize, and the brain can metabolize that experience, whatever it might be. And it's also important to remember that our trauma responses can change over time. And also that our brains are resilient and there's a lot of possibility for healing. The work that you all do can be part of that healing process for folks, which is why we're here. So my next question for folks, we have a lot of people with a lot of experience. How might we see trauma manifest itself in the day-to-day? What are some of the behaviors or experiences that people might have as a result of their trauma?
Irritability.
Irritability is one. What else, guys? There's one in the chat. Hypersensitivity. Anything else? Not showing up to appointments, right? So that executive functioning is lost. Apathy or numbness, very common. I don't care. Or just sort of sense of whatever happens, I'm not here. Anything else? I've got a whole list, so you knew I was going to do this. I'm just going to lay a bunch of them out. This is not exhaustive. So we've talked about how it can impair our cognitive functioning. There's all sorts of physical symptoms. I'm really struggling with connectivity this morning, guys. I'm so sorry. We'll get right back to where we were. How are we doing? Are we there? Thumbs up? Okay, good. Okay, let me just repin this. Okay. I'm going to keep flipping through these. This will be very familiar to many of you. Increased sensitivity to stress, shame and guilt, a lack of trust. This is all going to look familiar. You see this a lot in your day-to-day. Internalizing. If we go back, what do people think are some of the common trauma responses that can most often impair our ability to form good working relationships with the victims we serve? What are some of these trauma responses that tend to be the most difficult for you to work with? Anger is really hard. Yep.
Cara, I lost that question on what you were asking.
Sure. So the question is, what are some of these trauma responses that tend to be the most difficult when we're trying to form relationships with the victims we're serving? What about a lack of trust and difficulty sort of forming trusting relationships? Yeah, the distrust is really hard. If they don't think that you believe them, which is what Brian brought up, I mean, that's huge, that they don't think that you're there to help. Yeah. I think another one that can be really hard is all or nothing thinking. So the victim's like, I want so-and-so to go to jail for the rest of their life. And that's the only thing I want. And the only way that I'll know that I got justice. That's a really common one. That doesn't always come from a trauma response, but it can. That sort of that all or nothing thinking. Sometimes victims think if they're talking to the VWA that you have the power to make things happen. And you do have power, but not all of it, that's for sure. Sometimes they already hate law enforcement and they associate you with law enforcement, which can keep them at arm's length too, right? So that lack of trust can come from a lot of different places and not just from a trauma response. There can also be a sense of minimizing, right? So this will come up really often in, I think you'll especially see this in interpersonal violence cases. It wasn't that bad. It's not really that big of a deal. And you're sitting there reading the affidavit and all sorts of alarm bells are going off for you. You're like, no, this is really a big deal. And some of that comes from the experience of power and control in abusive relationships, but some of that can also come from the trauma response. Our brains are trying to protect us by saying it wasn't a big deal. Shame and guilt is also huge, right? So So often in the criminal justice process, there are moments where we need the victim to talk about what happened, and it's really hard to talk about, right? They feel a lot of shame. Some of that comes from a trauma response, and some of that comes from just our social conditioning. Courtney says that numbing can be really hard. She had a victim who sat through a sentence, didn't react, and then she had to tell her it was over and that we could go. Yeah. Yelling and crying, she says she can deal with, but it's hard to read the quiet. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And maybe you're sitting there too thinking, did I screw up? Is it me? Often it's not you. Most of the time it's not you. Okay. So the other thing that I think it's really important to keep in mind as well, and this could be the topic of its own training. And in fact, I think next week, that's exactly what the folks from MCEDV are going to be offering. But we also have to remember that folks who belong to any historically marginalized group, and that could be folks who are older or disabled, it could be kids, it could be people who belong to a different race or culture. They are more likely statistically to experience victimization across the board. Like, pick your historically marginalized group, the data shows they're more likely to experience victimization, and they're also less likely to seek out systems and trust systems. So that's, something that folks brought up is there are folks who don't trust law enforcement. Sometimes the reason why they don't trust law enforcement has to do with the experience of the community or culture that they belong to. Not always, but sometimes. So this is just another piece to keep in mind. It's another layer. And as we're thinking about how to be trauma informed and thinking about trauma informed communication, it's really important for us to recognize the places in ourselves where we don't belong to a historically marginalized group, and therefore we might be a little bit blinded to the ways that we're communicating and how they may or may not be helpful. So if you're working with someone who's deaf or hard of hearing and you're not deaf or hard of hearing, there's a lot of things that you can say or do that can make things worse. And so it's our job to seek out the training, seek out the information, seek out the knowledge so that we're able to break through those barriers as well. Because the experience of like having someone who's supposed to be working with you not get it, do or say something that's harmful, that in and of itself adds just another layer of trauma to this whole experience, right? So we want to prevent that where we can. Okay, we started to get into this a little bit. I feel like folks have already shared some good stuff. Across the board, what are the biggest barriers that you face when you're working with victims? And it could be anything, could be trauma related or not. Is it easy working with the courts? All due respect to the courts, of course.
I would say in terms of the sentencing, at least in our cases, because we get long sentences, and I feel like a broken record whenever I talk about this, but the courts seem resistant to order restitution in those cases, whether it's back to the victim or generally when it's back to the victim, yes, but when it's to victims comp, which it ends up being hurting the victims because that program, that is so frustrating when you run into that.
So like, so getting restitution ordered is a big barrier. Brian says keeping continued communication with folks, trying to get a hold of them and find them, having good contact information, that's a huge barrier. There are, Nicole alluded to a barrier, which is that VWAs are not the final decision makers, both in terms of whether a plea agreement is going to be accepted and in terms of what the court is going to sentence. There are a lot of ways that we can help to influence the process, but we don't get the final say, and our victims don't get the final say. There are a lot of barriers, and I wanted to sort of air this and put this out there so we could just have like a big sigh about it and say, okay, let's think about all the things that are outside of our control and outside the scope of what we can do. Right now with COVID, one of the things I hear about is tons of cases are getting called for jury draw. And we know that very few of them are actually going to go to trial. And so we're ramping up and getting victims all ready to go. And okay, we got to get ready for trial. You're going to trial, take the day off, only to tell them, nope, actually, never mind. We know that that's happening a lot. There are so many things that are out of our control. And so what we're going to move into are the pieces that are in our control. And that is how we show up with the people that we're working with and how we communicate with them. And I think sometimes, especially when our folks show up with their all or nothing thinking, and they're like, this process is useless and there will not be justice unless the defendant spends the rest of their life in jail, it can be really easy for us to jump on that bandwagon with them and not see all the power that we have and how much good that we can do just in the way that we listen and make space and affirm the experiences of people we're working with, and just using these simple tips. Because I mean, as you know, for those of you who raise children, and you might remember what it's like to have young children, there are so many things in our day-to-day we can't give our kids exactly what they want. But the way that we communicate that can make a huge difference in how they see the world. And, you know, not to say that our victims are like children, I don't mean to infantilize them, but again, if we stop and kind of move back for a second, we can see how much power we have in our day-to-day. I think it's a very similar analogy, and not just because I'm raising a young kid myself. Okay, so the principles of trauma-informed work. Number one, if we do nothing else, the plan is to do no further harm. And that is within our sphere, the work that we do. We can't prevent the prosecutor on the case from potentially doing further harm. That happens sometimes. We can't prevent the defense attorney from doing further harm, the courts. But we're going to do our best in what we do to do no further harm. As much as possible, we want to support and sustain safety, because if the folks we're working with don't feel safe, that amygdala is firing. And we know what happens when the amygdala is firing. It's going to shut down the parts of the brain that we need in order to be able to meet them where they are, work with them through the process, get them resources, all of that. So we want to be supporting and sustaining safety where we can, knowing though that it's not our job to guarantee safety, and we're not responsible for the safety of the people we work with. That's not in our control. We're going to support it. We're going to promote it where we can. And we're also going to try to promote insight, growth, and healing while we can. But that's really an advanced step, right? It's going to be hard for us to get to that place unless we have done no further harm and helped to support and sustain safety. Any thoughts or questions, by the way, before I start moving into the real meat of this stuff? Okay. So maybe this isn't where you thought I was going to start, but fundamentally, trauma-informed communication starts with you. And so that looks like understanding secondary trauma and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, and taking responsibility for addressing our own responses to trauma and stress in the work. Because all the tips that I'm about to go into, all the steps in the process, the ability to listen, the ability to use some creative thinking, the ability to use our emotional intelligence to sort of read the victim and see where they are. We can't do that without the human parts of our brain. And so if our own amygdalas, our own sort of stress response, our own fight or flight response is overtaking us in our day to day, it's going to make it really hard to use our own emotional capacity, our own executive functioning, our own logic and reasoning, creativity and memory to be able to do our best work. So that's really where it starts is, and I feel like, you know, it's like raise your hand if talking about self-care is stressful. Like that's me, because I'm like, oh, I failed that project. And I'm a type A, I don't like to get a bad grade. But this is just my like gentle reminder that we're just gonna put self-care into our day-to-day wherever we can. And I know that right now, especially with COVID, that's really hard to do. So that's where you can call me and I can help point you in good directions and I can help advocate for you too to get you what you need. Okay, so step one, first we're going to listen and listen some more. And so that means, especially when we're first meeting with someone, or maybe we're talking to them over the phone these days, maybe we're on Zoom, we're going to try to ask open-ended questions at first and really let the story flow. Let people say whatever it is that they need to say. By the way, even if it has nothing to do with the criminal process, even if they really want to see things happen that are not going to happen. We're going to try to, at least initially, just give them 5 or 10 minutes at the very least to let them say what they need to say. We're going to use big open-ended questions. What's been going on for you? How are you feeling about this? You know, wherever we are in terms of the conversation that we need to have. And we're just going to let it flow, trying not to interrupt at first. And when we do have that opening and that place to engage, as they're talking, we want to be trying to use encouraging body language. So that might look like sort of sitting forward for some folks, although for some folks it can be intimidating if you're a larger person. Sometimes if you're a man and we are leaning forward too much, that can be intimidating. So we have to also read our body language within our own bodies and how we present ourselves. And we want to try to use mirroring. So we're trying to nod. If someone's talking about something serious, we want to kind of model like, yeah, this is serious, right? Just like we would use mirroring if we were trying to communicate with a baby who can't use words. This is so human, how we show people that we're listening and that we're there and that we're present because we want to be present. So that means put the phone away, put it to the side, or if you're expecting a call, you can communicate in advance. This is really important to me. I have my cell phone here because I am expecting this call. But especially in our first meeting, let's try to avoid that. Let's try to schedule a first meeting or a first call when that's not going to happen. We want to then summarize and check for our own understanding of what the person said. So what I hear you saying is that you are really concerned for your safety right now. You have this other legal issue going on that's really worrying you. You know, what I'm hearing you say is that you'd really like to see some accountability in this case. So, you know, whatever that might be. And you also, you know, check for your understanding again and repeat back what you heard, even if it is illogical, irrational in your mind. It's they're not going to get it. That's not what we're even dealing with. You know, if the person is saying like, why isn't this person being charged? It's not fair. Let's start by repeating that back. I hear you saying that it's not fair that this person's getting charged. And I understand why you feel that way. And you sound really angry about it, right? So we're summarizing, we're checking our own understanding, making sure that we heard it right, and we're reflecting back that we heard it. We're going to take our time as much as possible, which I know for you all, that is difficult to give right now. The other thing we can do, which can be hard sometimes, is to honor silences and gaps. We want to be helpful. We want to have answers. But there are times when we don't have answers, and that's okay. And we can allow the silence to sort of sit. We can allow someone to think and process, and that's good. We're giving some power back to the victim, which is so important in everything that we're doing, because victimization is experiencing a loss of power, by the way. We're trying to give a little bit of power back by allowing them to just sit with silence for a minute. And we're going to be patient and present, allow that to happen. We want to avoid our judgment as much as possible. And so, you know, if the person is saying, I decided to move back in with so-and-so, i.e. defendant, you may have very reasonable judgments that have to do with safety. But if we want to show that we're listening, which is really important for building trust, to get to a place where the person cares about your opinion, then we're going to have to avoid judgment in hearing them out on that. I hear you're moving back in with the defendant. Now there's a time to sort of share our thoughts and feelings about that, but maybe initially that's not where we are. Okay. We're going to validate. So I've started to allude to this a little bit. We want to name and affirm those emotions. You know, it sounds like you're really sad right now. It sounds like you're grieving. It sounds like you're angry. I can hear how angry you are right now. And we're going to name and affirm all those things that people say that they want the defendant to go to jail for a really long time. I don't want the defendant to go to jail. I want the case to be dropped, whatever it might be. We're just going to say it out loud and acknowledge it. And then we're going to try to use that to tease out what it is that they actually need, because under wants are a pile of needs. Often when people want the defendant to go away for a really long time, what they really want is for the system to acknowledge that something bad happened to them, because on TV, that's what happens. If somebody does something bad to you, they go to jail for a really long time. That's what we all think. So we can tease out, you know, what I'm hearing is that what you really need is is some acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. And on that point, you know, we can be acknowledging that what happened is wrong, even if it's not a crime, by the way. You're not the lawyer, not the judge. So it's okay. It is totally okay, especially early on in the relationship, to say, look, what happened to you is wrong. And that's not giving anything away, and that's not setting up unmet expectations. That's totally fine. As much as possible when we're communicating too, if we can use ands instead of buts. And so that, I mean, I'm hearing that you're really frustrated. And I also know that we're going to have a hard time convincing the court to do X, Y, and Z. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And that's a more powerful way to not invalidate the way that that person feels than to say, I know that you're frustrated and you really want this person to go to jail for a really long time, but that's not going to happen. As soon as we put that but there, for humans, it can feel like we've erased everything that was said before. But is a way of contradicting the first part of the sentence. One thing here too that is so important, and you know, do as I say, not as I do. This is a really bad habit for me sometimes. We want to avoid trying to relate. So, oh yes, this has happened to me and I felt that way. Is actually when people tell their story and we follow up by telling our own story, often that is perceived as, oh, they weren't listening to what I was saying. They were thinking about what happened to them. So sometimes there are moments where it does make sense to relate and engage with our own stories. We want to be really thoughtful about when and where we deploy that. So we've talked a lot about building trust because this is so fundamental to the work. We're the ambassadors for our office. We're trying to help people build trust with us so that they'll build trust with the prosecutor on the case, so that we get to a point where they're ready to make a victim impact statement. They're ready to testify if they need to. And so we want to, as much as possible, try to see the whole person in the case and acknowledge the whole person in the case. And sometimes that means taking a little bit of extra time just to get to know them as people. And then in our later interactions, like, oh yeah, the last time we talked, you were saying that little Joey was going to start kindergarten. How was the first day of school? You know, those small things where we show the person that they're more than their victimization can be huge. We can, in that interaction, by the way, work on relating. Oh yeah, like I sent my kid to that school too. I loved Mrs. So-and-so, the third grade teacher. You know, that's an okay way to relate. We also, and this is huge, start by believing. So by that I mean we need to on the first go around, whatever they say, as crazy as it might sound to you, as implausible as it might sound, or maybe based on the way that they're presenting, they don't look like, or they're not acting like this happened. We're not the judge. We're not the prosecutor. We're not the investigator. And so we can have our suspicions about what did or didn't happen, but it's really our job to just believe folks. And especially if we start that way, if somebody hasn't told us the truth, they're far more likely to build enough trust to tell us what really did happen or what we really need to know later on, if we haven't sort of started off the relationship with judging and questioning. We could do a whole day just on that topic. If you know, in our roles, or in your role as working within a prosecutor's office, it is really important that the prosecutor doesn't do what's called suborning perjuries, right? So putting false testimony on the stand. And, you know, if you are in a place where you are suspicious of a story or what's going on, you can and should definitely consult with the prosecutor on the case around how to handle that. But in the meantime, again, we want to do what we can to preserve the relationship, and questioning someone's story is not a good place to start. It's also really important that we keep every little promise, or that we don't make promises that we're not going to be able to keep. So if we say, look, I'm going to call you on Tuesday, then we need to call on Tuesday. Or we need to say, look, I'm going to call you back. I don't know when I'm going to be able to do it. I have a really busy week next week, but this is important to me and I'm going to call you back. And maybe we're getting to the end of that next week and we don't have the answer that we need. We're going to touch base or send a quick email. I still don't have that answer for you, but it is important and I want to get back in touch with you about it. So I know too, that so often in the work, we are making promises and setting expectations that are broken, not because of us or anything that we've done, but because this is how the system is. You know, you're going to trial next week and then nope, you're not. So one way to avoid making promises that we can't keep is by setting realistic expectations. So right now, with that sort of trial example, we would say, so just so you know, a lot of cases are getting called for a jury trial right now. A lot of cases the court is trying to push towards trial. Doesn't necessarily mean the trial is going to happen. I expect to hear from me. Things could change. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that we might go to trial, but it's also possible that we might not. And so keep that in mind too, right? So we want to be really clear in our communications, and also we need to set some good boundaries. This is another way to maintain trust. Is most of you, my understanding is that these are 9-to-5 jobs, and there's often, although there are some exceptions to this, but there's often very little that we're going to be able to do within our role at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. And so setting those upfront expectations that we're not available at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night is really important. And along the same lines, setting and maintaining boundaries and good expectations around confidentiality. So as prosecution-based advocates, there are limitations in terms of what we're able to keep confidential. And so if we explain that really clearly early on, we can even put a little note in our signature line of our email, for example, communication to this email address is not confidential. I can give you some language I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I'll give you some language that you can put just again as that reminder, like you send me this email, it might be discoverable. It's also really, and this can be so hard to acknowledge what you don't know, even if it's something you think you should know. And so for those of you who are just starting out, victims are going to ask you a lot of questions and you really feel like you should know the answer. It's a basic enough question. It's an easy enough one, but it's so important that we don't just make something up and that we say, you know what, that's a really good question and I want to get an answer for you and I'll get back in touch. Any other thoughts before I keep moving on listening, on building trust? Any comments or thoughts or questions people want to share? Okay, I'm going to keep moving.
I would
Go
just
ahead.
like to say that even after all these years, I still have to work on that. Like it's still something I have to cognizantly realize that I'm not interrupting them or I'm not. So
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge, especially, you know the answer, you know where this is going, you've done this before. You want to jump there, right? And we have to this is like a process. We have to let it play out. Every little bit counts. And by the way, like if all we've done is listen, that experience, that maybe that's the one phone call, the one interaction, that in and of itself, of being that kind person who listened with compassion and mirrored and said what happened to you was wrong, that's the only interaction that actually can have a huge impact on the trajectory of someone's healing from this experience, even if everything else in the case goes wrong. And so that's where I hope you all can see the power that you have in every small interaction in your day-to-day, if even if nothing else works out. So the next piece is we want to collaborate with the victim, and we want to empower the victim as much as possible. Again, this is hard in a system where that's not very empowering and where there aren't the victim doesn't have very much decision-making authority. But nonetheless, we're going to present all the options, even minor options, even options that, we don't think are the great choices. Again, not to infantilize our victims, because they are certainly, most of them are very capable, competent adults, but in some ways that this holds, if you have a toddler, you're always trying to give options when they're getting ready for tantrums. Like, well, do you want to wear the red shoes or the blue shoes, right? And if we think about it, the amygdala, the trauma brain, is a lot like the brain of a toddler in terms of the level of development. And so we're trying to calm that amygdala, right, by giving some small options. Sometimes options can be overwhelming, and so there's a dance there. But by giving options, we're saying, no, you're in control. What happened to you removed a lot of control from you, took your power away from you. Even, by the way, we could be talking about a property crime. You expected that no one was coming into your house in the middle of the night to steal something when you weren't there. Maybe you weren't there, but someone did and took something from you. That can be traumatic. And that's an experience of having your power taken away from you. So as we move forward in this process, we're going to try to give options. We're going to applaud all the positive steps taken that people take to take power back and to make choices and exercise options and to show up, even the small things. So sometimes we take for granted, because we're in the system, what a big deal it is to call the state's attorney's office and ask to speak to the victim advocate. It'd be pretty intimidating, especially for someone who's never dealt with the system before. Maybe for someone who has dealt with the system before, it'd be pretty scary and intimidating. And so we can applaud those small positive steps. It's a really big deal that you called today, and I'm glad you did. I'm really happy to talk to you. It's a really big deal that you applied for housing. You did a great job filling out the comp application. I'm really glad that you were able to take the initiative for yourself. So, we want to see our role as being that supporting role, that coach role, that cheerleader role. Sometimes there are things that we end up doing for victims because they can't do it for themselves. I mean, Joanna, working on homicide cases, often ends up filling out comp applications because the folks she works with are so exhausted of filling out forms and doing the same thing. But when Joanna is offering that, it is offered as an option. Would you like me to help you fill out the comp application, as opposed to I do the comp application, right? Because when we do that, we can actually sometimes start to replicate the bad power dynamics that were part of the victimization. We want to avoid as much as possible saying you have to. Now, that can be hard because you might have a prosecutor saying that someone has to do X, Y, and Z. But that's not your job. The prosecutor wants to communicate that. We can set up a meeting. But in our work, and if we're going to help empower this person, if we're going to build that trusting relationship, we're not going to impose our own priorities. We're not going to impose the prosecutor's priorities, the system's priorities. We can communicate what they are. We can talk about the options. We can talk about what happens if folks do or don't exercise certain options. But it's always presented as an option, if that makes sense. Very subtle shifts, by the way. So as we started out too, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing safety and basic needs. If someone's talking to us with a hungry belly, or they're very tired, that in and of itself, set aside the trauma, will have the amygdala sort of firing, saying, I'm hungry, it's time to eat. And sort of shutting down the executive functioning, the reasoning, the logic part of the brain. And that's just sort of a small example of this sort of bigger picture thing. The reason why we are making referrals to community-based resources, to victims' compensation, doing all of that stuff as much as we can is so that when people have their basic needs met, they are able to then show up and do that higher level work that this process demands of them. Likewise with safety, there are the big things, and we all know, like bail conditions are about safety, and pursuing a protective order is about safety and sort of where the defendant is in relation to the victim. There's lots that we can do there to prioritize safety, to work with the prosecutor, to request the things that the victim needs, to refer to legal services, to pursue protective order, all of that stuff, right? But we can also look at this in more of a micro way. So if and when we're having meetings in offices again, think about the physical spaces where we're meeting. That's a way that we can prioritize safety too. Is the person sitting so they can see the door, right? Some people like to sleep in their room, right? So they can see the door at night. So this will be a familiar idea to some of you. We can also sort of think about the timing of things. When are we meeting? Are we meeting at a time when the defendant's at work? And that helps the person to feel more safe. And the expert on safety is the victim. So in prioritizing safety and basic needs, what we're doing is we're asking questions to gather the information from the victim. We're presenting options. We're helping them to make choices so that we're supporting them in prioritizing their safety and their basic needs for themselves as well. This can be really difficult, again, in our domestic violence cases, for example. So often addressing safety and addressing basic needs are in direct conflict. How do you expect me to prioritize safety, not being assaulted again, when I'm trying to meet my basic needs by having a place to live, and that's with the defendant's family? for example, or that's how I need this case to go away because the defendant is our breadwinner and will lose their job. So none of this comes with like easy answers. There's no like magic formula. There's no script I can offer. But what I would encourage you though is to really deeply listen and trust the expert, because the person in front of you is going to know their own life best. At least when we're talking about adults. Could be a different story if we're talking about children, and it could be a different story if we're talking about an adult with an intellectual disability, or maybe someone with diminished capacity in some way. And again, on this, we want to avoid judgment. Any other questions or thoughts? There's something in the chat. I'm cutting in and out. I hate Spectrum. Okay. How are we doing now, Joanna? I'm back. Okay. Difficult calls and meetings. So this is the question that I get most often. How do I handle all these difficult calls and meetings? So first, my first tip is that we want to put some time into setting the stage, making sure that we've set aside ample time for the meeting that we need to have, making sure that the right people are there. So if we've been working with the victim a whole bunch and we've built a relationship there, and maybe the case still hasn't been charged for whatever reason, the prosecutor's been evaluating the case. And so having a conversation about a decision not to charge, or maybe to charge a far lower offense than what anyone might have expected, that's probably going to be the sort of meeting where we need to set the stage by making sure the prosecutor's there to be the person to communicate the law and the decision making and explain that process. So sometimes setting the stage is really about the cast of characters that we're bringing into the room. That can be part of it. Maybe if it's the right kind of case, setting the stage involves making sure the district attorney is there too, right? It might be at that level. So that's part of the responsibility for the VWAs to really think about who are the players and who needs to be in the room. I can't give you a script on this. This is something you'll have to work on and learn as you go. In any event, even if you're the one communicating the bad news, we want to really make sure that we don't try to sugarcoat it. Well, at least X, Y, and Z is going to happen. Instead, we want to go right back to those basic skills that we were talking about at the beginning, and focus less on us trying to solve the problem, fix the emotions. A lot of us are trained to like, oh, don't like emotions. We got to fix it. If somebody has it, crying, angry, whatever, fix it. Let's just let those emotions be. And then that's a good segue too into thinking about, my rule is if you see a yellow flag, slow down, and when you see a red flag, stop. So what are my yellow flags? This is where we're going to use our emotional intelligence and being really present and focused to be able to see when somebody's demeanor is starting to change in the course of the conversation, or maybe we're even starting out at a bad place. They're looking down at the floor, they're tapping their fingers, they're picking at their face, those sort of like nervous behaviors. Maybe someone's starting to get a little red. Maybe their speech pattern is starting to change, where they're either showing some numbing or they're starting to show a little bit of agitation. So when we see those yellow flags, that's the time to slow down. Let's not keep pushing through this conversation. Let's slow the conversation back down. Let them finish what they need to say, and use some of our tools to help get them back into that like prefrontal cortex, the logic and the reasoning sort of headspace. We might even observe, I'm seeing it looks like, you're starting to have some feelings about this, or I can see that you're starting to get a little distracted. So let's talk about X, Y, and Z. Maybe we go in a different direction. We can come back. That's one thing we can do. Or we can just sort of mirror and acknowledge that. We can ask and give power back to the victim. Do you want to take a little break? Do you need a glass of water? Or we just acknowledge what's going on. This is really difficult to talk about, isn't it? Yeah, I completely understand. Right? So there are some ways that we can like slow the pace of things. Red flags are the sort of the message that's telling us this person is completely in that fight or flight brain, that amygdala headspace, and they're triggered. We are not going to get anywhere with this conversation. So it is time to stop. Maybe we'll be able to stop and take a break and come back to it, but maybe this just isn't the best time to do this. If we try to keep pushing forward and push through this and get to some destination that we had planned in advance, it's not going to help us to push through. So that's when the person is screaming at you. That's when the person is uncontrollably crying. I'm trying to think of some other or big red flag signs. The person has like stood up from their chair. Do I see another red flag sign? Yeah, so these are the signs that maybe they've just shut down. It's nothing to say. They're completely just looking at the floor. We see a red flag, we're going to stop. And we're going to talk a little bit about dealing with folks who are angry in a second, but this is when we can say, you know what, we can be a cheerleader for this meeting. We can say, I can tell this is really hard and we've gotten a lot done for today. Again, we can give them choice. Do you want to take a break? This isn't how to deal with someone who's angry, but maybe someone who's really uncontrollably sad, maybe somebody who has sort of shut down emotionally, they've numbed out. Why don't we just take a break for a second? Well, why don't we set up another time? Maybe we're talking on the phone. Why don't we set up another time to finish this conversation? So those are all options. Because we, by the way, are in control of this conversation. We're the master of this conversation. We're the facilitator. So we don't need to have this conversation happen to us. We're going to help direct the pace and the flow. Now let's talk about when victims get mad, which happens all the time. First thing, I know for me, I'm someone who gets very triggered when people are angry. And I'm somebody who was definitely raised to try to fix anger and try to calm anger and try to make it stop. That's part of my social conditioning. It is nonetheless really important in these moments, for me, for anyone, to remember that this response of anger is often coming from a trauma response, not always. And then it's an unconscious behavior. And so it's not about you. They're not angry at you. They might say they're angry at you, but they're probably not angry at you. Maybe you did screw something up. The fact that they're reacting the way that they're reacting is not about you. And so you don't need to make it about you by arguing the point, pushing through it, trying to calm it, trying to tamp it down. We're just going to go back to the basics. We're going to offer empathy. We're going to mirror. I can hear you're really angry right now, and I understand why you're angry. And maybe we're even going to allow that to settle a little bit and not keep talking at them. Because again, the rational, logical brain is not hearing what's going on, potentially. We're going to offer our respect. We're going to respond to any misinformation. Maybe they've gotten something wrong. So we can certainly correct that, but we're not going to argue it with them. The question is, do you want to be right? And you might be right. Or do you want to be effective in the long run? And we want to try to focus on being effective. And the time to be right is not going to be this time when the victim is mad, because they're not in a place to hear you and reason with you. And then after the fact, we definitely need to address our kind of unconscious response. And if we're able to see our unconscious response, that our own sort of tensing, our own amygdala response, our own sort of fight or flight that might be happening, in the moment, we might be able to see that and address that by taking a deep breath. Maybe sometimes I have like hand gestures that I use to like say, okay, let's be present. When I used to argue cases, I would hold a pen like this, and this was my reminder to be present and not like wave my hands around. So you might develop a little habit or something to tell you, maybe put your hand over your heart for a minute, something to tell yourself, okay, I see that I'm going to this place where the person is too, and it's my job to slow this back down. Because you control the pace. You do. And that's right down to saying, you're on the phone with somebody. I can tell that you're really angry. I don't think this is going to be the best way to have this conversation. And I'm gonna let you go now. And I'm gonna call you back in an hour. That might be what you need to do. Other thoughts on, because we have a lot of experience in the room, what to do when victims get mad. Anything? Okay. So I'm going to go right back around. Actually, we got something in the chat. Becky says, let them get mad. Well, that's the thing, right? They need to get mad. It's part of the process. Let them. Absolutely. So I'm going to go right back around to where we started. These are some signs of trauma exposure. So vicarious trauma exposure. And I don't put up this list. This is not like a list of shame. Right. Brian says, don't elevate with them. Don't go where they are in that anger. Right. These are some signs of trauma exposure, some signs of vicarious trauma. Like I said, that's not the list of shame. I'll tell you, like, my favorite go-to is procrastination. That's where I go when I'm in my trauma-induced anxiety. But I put this up just so these might be some things that you start to see in yourself sometimes that remind you that something's got to change and that you need to listen to your body, listen to your mind. This is your body telling you there's stuff going on. This is your mind telling you there's stuff going on. And it's time to figure out how to refill the cup, I think, as Sarah said, maybe. We've got to refill the cup so that we have the ability to go back and do all those things that we just walked through: listening, validating, prioritizing safety and basic needs, being able to identify the yellow flags and the red flags, being able to not elevate with the person who's getting progressively more angry, as Brian was talking about. So this is the piece where, if you do nothing else, trauma-informed communication is actually about taking care of yourself. We start there so that we do have the ability to be present and to show up for the people we're working with. Again, if that's a piece that you need help with, that is another reason why I'm here. You can reach out to me and we can sort of talk about how to go about getting what you need to get where you want to be. Any other questions or thoughts? I'd love to hear them. And I'm really sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I know that you kind of prefaced this training as it was, the fundamentals and stuff, but I think, looking at the people that have joined us for the training today, I think it's a good thing to bring everybody back to the basis. It's kind of the core of what we start, doing this job, or how we start doing this job. So the reminders for those who have been doing it a number of years is always a good thing, as well as, those that are newer to the role. So thanks for doing it.
Thanks for the feedback, Kim. It's really awesome to see you here today. I appreciate it.
I also have a little cheat sheet of things to say and things not to say.
Oh,
I kind of keep under my desk and remember that, this may be my, 27th domestic violence call this month or whatever it is. But it may be there first, so just keeping that perspective, I think, is important.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. If you want to share your cheat sheet, I love to send it around too. That sounds great. Yeah. And Brian says too that it's important to remind ourselves of this stuff because it's easy to slip back into not doing the stuff we need to do. I mean, especially, trauma-informed communication does not come naturally to a lot of folks in our culture. It's just not. It's not the way that we're necessarily trained to be. So, we all have habits and patterns that it's easy for us to slip back into, especially, things that we might have been praised, qualities that we were praised for having when we were younger, to be the helper and the doer and to step in and do for other people, right? That was certainly some social conditioning that I got. And I'm always having to remind myself to not fall back into that habit and to try to empower the folks I'm working with as much as possible. Yeah, and Brian says too that it can be hard when people have more subtle signs of trauma. I think too it can be hard when the stereotype that I kind of keep in my head is like the grumpy old white guy is not our like stereotypical crime victim in our culture, and really could be someone who is showing up with a lot of anger, for example, because of a trauma response. And it's like all the more reason why we want to show up with like trauma-informed communication with them and take control back in that in sort of how the course of that meeting is going to go, while giving them as much control as possible, options, etc. Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in? Questions or thoughts? So fun to see this group here today. It's such a mix.
So I'm sorry I had to step away, but I just found out that I have to notify a family on a case where that the conviction was vacated today. So.
Oh, difficult meeting.
Especially since I don't know these people. It's Michelle's case.
Yeah. That is a difficult meeting.
Fun.
Anyone else want to chime in? Okay. You know where to find me. Definitely send me questions. And I apologize for the connectivity issues today. I'm really sorry I was cutting in and out. I'm going to call Spectrum again. We'll get it fixed. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks for coming. I'll see you soon. Take care.